Tonight is the 5th night of our Vacation Bible School. We trust that our subject and our study will be of help to you. This week we have studied our big God. And we've noticed the lives of Elijah and Elisha, incidents out of those lives that have provided for us, in my judgment, some very needed lessons. And I believe tonight is no exception to that. When we look at the idea, God is bigger than our thoughts. Often when you are discussing religion with someone, it is common for them to say something like, "What do you think about this?" And they are very sincere in asking that question. They believe your thoughts on it might be beneficial because of your knowledge or expertise or years of study or work in that area. A Christian will divert that question by saying, "It really does not matter what I think about it. Let's go see what the Bible says about it." Because when the Bible speaks, that's it, whether I think that or not. And I need to understand that the Bible is a revelation of the thoughts of God to man. And I need to bring my thought processes into an alignment with the thinking process of God if I'm going to be pleasing to Him. So through revelation, through the Scriptures, I can know the mind of God. And I can know how to be pleasing to Him. And every religious question ought to be settled by, what does the Bible teach? And my thinking on the matter is only that. It can go no higher than me for any kind of authority. Tonight I invite your attention to the 5th chapter of the book of 2 Kings. And in that chapter we're going to be looking at a well-known Bible character by the name of Naaman. Probably most people who've been associated with some Bible classes through their youth have at least sat in a class where Naaman was either taught or mentioned. So it probably is not an unfamiliar story to many of you who may be studying with us tonight. But I want us to look at Naaman from the standpoint God is bigger than our thoughts. In verse 1, we are introduced to the character of this man, Naaman. Now, Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria, was a great and honorable man in the eyes of his master, because by him Jehovah had given victory to Syria. He was also a mighty man of valor, a leper. Probably the word "but" is in italics in your translation, which means it's supplied by the translator. There would be no Hebrew word there to translate. It's really not needed. It's simply another adjective describing Naaman. You see 5 very commendable things about Naaman in that characterization. He was a great man, as the world would look at great men. You see his position. He was captain in Syria, captain in the army, a high position for him to occupy. You notice his personality. He was a great and honorable man in the eyes of his master, the king. So to be admired like that, to be considered honorable, speaks a great amount for the character of this man Naaman. You see in the third place his prosperity. He was victorious in his battles. So when he went out on the battlefield, he came back victorious. A great accolade for one who is a captain of the Syrian army. In the fourth place, you see his potency. He was a man of valor, great power, willingness to put himself forward in the conquest. And then you are alerted to his people by implication. He was a Gentile. And in this chapter, you see Jehovah reaching out to the Gentiles through the nation of Israel, which is a point that I believe a lot of people have missed in their study of the Bible. God used Israel to reach the heathen people, to reach the Gentile people under the law of Moses, and to bring them as proselytes, either proselytes of the gate or full proselytes under the amenability to the law of Moses. So you see those five things about his character. But in the second place, in verse 1, you would see Naaman's complaint. He suffered a very grievous malady. He was a leper. Now, one thing that comes to mind is, in spite of all the great things said about him, he suffered. Look at all he'd accomplished suffering. Having a handicap, having a disability, if you please. And yet he had accomplished great things. If you read the 13th and 14th chapters of the book of Leviticus, you come to an understanding of how leprosy was treated under the law of Moses. Evidently, from the details given in this chapter, leprosy in Syria was treated a lot differently. Or, and we'll have to get to heaven to know for sure, because no one knows, because the Bible doesn't tell us. Naaman had some kind of leprosy that did not bring on him the consequences that the leprosy we read about in Leviticus and 13 and 14 did on Israel. But the consequences on Israel were tied not only to the disease, they were tied to the ceremonial cleanliness of the people of God. And that may account for some of the things that are not done with leprosy with Naaman that would have been done under the law of Moses for Israel. So Naaman shows that one can accomplish great things in spite of handicaps. I want us to realize one thing tonight. Every accountable being in this class is handicapped in one way or another. We're not all able to do everything everyone else is able to do. We don't call it handicap, we call it limitation. But there are some things I cannot do because I'm limited in my ability to do that. There are some things you cannot do. But because I'm limited in something I cannot do does not mean I cannot do to the very best of my ability what I can do and accomplish great things in doing it. And if you will study some of the more notable characters in the world, you will find many of them suffered under various limitations, various handicaps, and yet they accomplished great things. So we need to realize spiritually that some of the people who have attained greatness in the eye of the world suffer from the malady and the consequences of sin, and they are separated from God. And that would say they are great in the eyes of the world, but they're not great in the eyes of God. When you read the first chapter of the book of Luke and you have the announcement of the birth of John the Immerser and then the announcement of the birth of Jesus, both of them are called great. And you would do well to look at the limiting phrases as to in whose eyes each of them will be said and is great. So Naaman was a great man. In verses 2 and 3, you see what I call the young girl's concern. Now, in your translation, she may be called a maiden. So you would have the maiden's concern. And the Syrians had gone out on raids and had brought back captive a young girl from the land of Israel. She waited on Naaman's wife. Let's look first of all at her circumstance. Did you get that part right there? Captive. Whatever may be said about her, and whatever may be seen in this context, it was never good to be a captive. It was never good to be a slave. Even though some of the greatest events in Bible history, especially in the Old Testament, were brought about by people who were in slavery. And you think about people like Joseph. It wasn't good to be where Joseph was. In fact, you remember he said to the butler, when you get out, tell Pharaoh about me. I'm in here unjustly. Now, he was accomplishing great things, but he was not still in a good circumstance. So this little girl, and the idea of little is the idea of young here, is in a bad situation. But she's doing good in a bad situation to those who did her wrong. Those of us who are Christians have to really fight our attitude sometimes toward those who do us wrong. It is not hard to do good to people who do you good. But there comes a challenge sometimes to do good for people who are actively doing you wrong. And we see this kind of an attitude in this young girl. She was a slave who served, literally, who was before Naaman's wife. And in 2 Kings chapter 5, there is a great emphasis on the servants, all of whom worked in Naaman's best interest. And if you ever want to develop a lesson on what it means to be a servant who does good to others, this is a great chapter. And we will talk about these servants as we move through. And this young girl is one of them. And notice that she's serving God as a young person. If we're not careful, sometimes we will minimize the service of young people. There's a great work in the kingdom for people who are young. And in your outline, I have given you a number of passages that refer to people who made a great contribution in the context in which they're found, who were young people. Every generation of old folks have said through history that the world is going to the dogs because of the young generation. So if you old folks have said that, you've just joined in with others of history who've always looked at it that way. But there are some great young people. There are some great Christian young people. And we are grateful for them. So if you have young people where you are, if in your home you have children, build up what they can do as a young person in the service of God. Build up how they can be great people. And when they're old enough to become Christians, to be great Christians as young people. Young people often influence people whom old folks will never reach. I remember one of the works I had. I was a kid, really. I wasn't much older than the young people. And I was teaching them on Sunday morning, and we had a great class. They were learning, they were excited. And our auditorium had 2 sections. And on my right, when I stood up to preach, we had 3 full pews of young people. And they were active. They were active in the school system. They were active among their friends. And they were bringing their friends. And they were studying the Bible with their friends. And often at lunch, I'd go home. Now that's dinner to us Southerners. I'd go home for dinner, and the telephone would ring, and it'd be one of those students at school calling to say, James, we're studying the Bible at lunch, and we've run up on this question, can you help us with it? And I'd help them or study the Bible with them over the phone at dinner time. There's a lot young people can do. So here's a young girl that is doing good to people who are not doing her good as a young person. But not only do you see her circumstance, you see her conversion. Look at verse 3. Then she said to her mistress, if only my master were with the prophet who is in Samaria, for he would heal him of his leprosy. Her conversion is seen by what she said. People can tell whether or not we're converted by our conversation. And she says, if only my master were with. Again, you have that same word used of the young girl and Naaman's wife. Only if he was before the prophet who is in Samaria. Notice that her conversion caused her to talk about God, even in adverse and difficult circumstances. Now this would seem to speak well of her parents. Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 to 9, the parents were told to lay the Word of God up in their hearts and teach them diligently to their children, and there's a 4-fold teaching program laid down in that passage. And it would seem to imply this girl's parents had done a good job. But talking about God in Syria, in Naaman's house, as far as we know, caused this girl to be able to do something that nobody else in Naaman's house could do. We don't read of anybody else in Naaman's house talking about God. Parallel that with Genesis 39, and you don't read about anybody else in Potiphar's house talking about God except Joseph. Parallel that with Daniel 1, and you don't read about anybody in Nebuchadnezzar's house talking about God but Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So here's this young girl in difficult circumstances, and her conversion causes her to talk about God. Notice that in the second place, her conversion caused her to take her religion into Syria with her. She's keeping the law, Leviticus 19:18, love your neighbors, you love yourself. So she took a religion, even though she went as a captive, her religion didn't fall off at the Israeli-Syria border. It's been amazing to me in 52 years of trying to preach how some folks' Christianity falls off of them when they cross the Florida line. And it seems as though they can dress in Florida the way they wouldn't dress anywhere else. Her religion didn't fall off of her. But then, in the third place, her conversion caused her to tie Naaman's cleansing to contact with the prophet, and that's that Hebrew word nabi, one of the words used for a prophet. The prophet of God in Samaria. She tied the cleansing to contact with the prophet. Now, there were other prophets working at this time. The schools of the prophets are functioning, and yet she singled out one prophet. We know from Luke chapter 4 and verse 27 that Elisha did not heal any other lepers during this time. So her conversion was not tied to what she had seen concerning lepers, but it was tied to what she knew concerning Jehovah. She knew a prophet could not successfully act without authority from Jehovah. Therefore, she tied the cleansing to God. And in order for Naaman to be cleansed, he would at least have to admit the possibility that Jehovah has more power than Rimmon, the major god of Syria. All of this brought about by a young girl working for God in difficult circumstances. But notice in verse 3, you also have her confidence. She saw the cleansing as a reality, not a possibility. She said he would heal him of his leprosy. Now she's going out on a limb. She's saying if Naaman is with the prophet of God in Samaria, he will come back a healed man. No doubt in her mind about it. And you see her confidence in a prophet tied to God. In verses 4 to 7, we bring about confusion among two major kings. Notice in verse 4, you have the maiden's conversation. And Naaman went in and told his master, saying, Thus and thus said the girl who is from the land of Israel. Now let me update thus and thus for those of you who are living in our day. It's generally coming across as blah, 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 blah. This is what she said. But I want you to notice that her communication came to Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria. Notice the weight that her words carried. Here's what the young girl from Israel said, and this is being brought to the king as worthy of the king's consideration. So Ben-Hadad, in all of his great ignorance, said, Go now, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel. So he departed and took with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 of gold, and 10 changes of raiment. Then he brought the letter to the king of Israel, which said, Now be advised, when this letter comes to you, that I have sent Naaman my servant to you, that you may heal him of his leprosy. Notice Ben-Hadad did not honor the reference to the prophet in Israel. Could this have been, we'll have to get to heaven to know for sure, that he would not acknowledge a God more powerful than Rimmon? But if you think Ben-Hadad was confused, you hadn't seen anything. Wait till you see Jehoram. Verse 7, it happened when the king of Israel, that's Jehoram, read the letter, that he tore his clothes and said, am I Elohim to kill and make alive, that this man sends a man to me to heal him of his leprosy? Therefore, please consider and see how he seeks a quarrel with me. Notice Ben-Hadad sent Naaman to the wrong person. The maiden in verse 3 said prophet, not king. And a problem that demanded a prophet for its resolution could not be resolved without the presence of that prophet. But you see Naaman's consent in this, because he came. He had three things when he came. He had a letter of recommendation, he had a request, and he had great riches. But that brings us to consider what I call Jehoram's conundrum, his problem. Verse 7. Jehoram was a calf worship king. 2 Kings chapter 3, the first three verses will tell us that. He's following in the footsteps of Jeroboam the son of Nebat. So he did not accept the validity of the prophet of God in Samaria. So he has a problem. Jehoram was helpless in this situation. Notice he rent his clothes in despair and asked if the king of Syria thought he was Elohim, thought he was God to be able to heal a man. And then he reasoned, the king of Syria knows I can't do this, and he's using this as an opportunity, as a reason to come against me in war. So you have some confusion going on among these kings. Now we come to the thrust of our study in verses 8 through 14, Naaman's cleansing. Notice, first of all, in verses 8 and 9, it required the proper source. So it was when Elisha, the man of God, the man of Elohim, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, that he sent to the king, saying, why have you torn your clothes? Please let him come to me, and he shall know that there's a prophet in Israel. Then Naaman went with his horses and chariot, and he stood at the door of Elisha's house. Remember, Naaman must go to the prophet in Samaria, verse 3, not the king. So you have Elisha's sending. Elisha sent for Naaman to come to his house in Samaria. How did Elisha know about Jehoram's reaction? He became aware of it, but we're not told how. Elisha is the man of God, one of the designations of a prophet. 1 Kings 12:22, first time we see that used. Elisha worked for Jehovah, so the cure would have to come from a supernatural place, not natural. And Elisha's sending for Naaman is an example of Jehovah's reaching out to those who need him, and specifically here to a Gentile. So let's look at some things. First of all, Naaman had gone to the wrong source for cleansing. But even though that had been the case, Jehovah sent for Naaman. Notice God took the initiative. just like he did in Genesis 3 in saving Adam and Eve with a plan of salvation. Just like he did with us, John 3:16 and Romans 5:8 and 9. Notice, secondly, that Jehovah's healing of Naaman's leprosy would allow Naaman and Jehoram to know there is a prophet, a Nabi, in Israel. Jehoram didn't recognize that because he's a calf worship king. And in the third place, Naaman would learn the power of Jehovah through Elisha. There's a prophet in Samaria, and that's where you need to be. But notice in verse 9, Naaman's standing. He came and he stood at the door of Elisha's house. Now, Naaman is with the proper source, but he's not healed because there are requirements that are to be met in order for him to be healed. So it required the proper source. In verse 10, it required the proper solution. And Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored to you, and you shall be, or you be clean. There was an angel involved in this. The word messenger here is from that word malach that's used to be either a human messenger or a heavenly messenger, translated angel. Here it's a human messenger. So Elisha sent the instructions by an unnamed messenger. Here's the second servant that's working in behalf of Naaman. Now the messenger has to be one who will deliver the message faithfully. Naaman's cure hinged on his getting the proper message. If the messenger changes the message, Naaman will leave a leper. With us, this shows, and it showed here, the power is in the message, not in the man. The power was not in Elisha. The power was in the message from God. So he had to come. There was an angel involved, but there were actions to be executed. Notice, go. Now, if you mark in your Bible, you have a coordinating conjunction that joins things of equal standing. And. Go and wash. And that word means to bathe yourself in the Jordan 7 times. Who in this class or in any other class who thinks clearly would ever say, if Naaman went to the Jordan River, he'd be cleansed? He goes down to Jordan, automatically clean. That's where that coordinating conjunction comes in. Now, if you can learn it here, it'll help you later on. He has to go and wash. But he has to go and wash 7 times in the Jordan River. The background for 7 washings comes from the law of leprosy in Leviticus 13 and 14. So this takes Naaman to the law of God. He's washing according to the ceremonial cleansing of the law of Moses. Notice there was a specific place, the Jordan River. Now this means he had to journey about 20 miles. Is one river as good as another when God specifies? This would require a good and honest heart that would do these things that I've spelled out for you in your notes that are tied to the parable of the sower and the receiving of the seed that is sown. Number 1, he would have to welcome the instructions. Mark 4, verse 20. He would have to understand the instructions. Matthew 13, 23. He would have to hold the instructions fast. Luke 8, verse 15. in order to reap the reward. So there had to be a spirit, there had to be an attitude involved in Naaman in response to the message that was delivered him. And there was an accomplishment to be enjoyed. Your flesh shall be restored to you, and you shall be clean. Now, if you mark in your notes, the blessing was conditioned upon his complete obedience. Just standing by the Jordan River didn't clean him. Just going to some kind of river and dipping didn't clean him. He had to dip 7 times in the Jordan River. His accomplishment was tied to complete obedience. And I really didn't have to put the word complete there. I did for emphasis, because you either obey or you don't, and if you don't obey, it's incomplete. But we sometimes get the point with that word complete. So it required the proper spirit. Look at verses 11 to 14. You have a contrast. But, now I'm going to stress 2 coordinating conjunctions that are very important in this section. Number 1 is and. Number 2 is but. Naaman's reaction, verse 11, he became furious. Naaman's reasoning. This cure offended 2 things. It offended his human pride, and it clashed with his popular prejudice. And it's amazing how many people those 2 things have caused to be lost. Human pride. Notice he said, I thought. The New King James, I said to myself. I said in my heart, literally. That sounds a lot like what Paul said he did in Acts 8 and in Acts 26. Here's what he said. He will come out to me. He didn't come out, he sent a messenger. He will stand and call on the name of Jehovah his God, Elohim. So he'll just come out and he'll stand where I am and he'll call on Elohim and he'll wave his hand over the place. I see the lack of capitalization. And he will heal the leprosy. Notice Naaman had it made up in his mind how it had to be done in order for him to be cleansed. Now, if that doesn't happen, he's furious. That's really big of him, isn't it? He's over there asking to be clean, and he's furious with the instructions. But notice, not only that, you have his popular prejudice. When he says, are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, notice this, not even equal to, but better than all the waters of Israel? May I not wash in them and be clean? Now, when God specifies, as I asked a moment ago, is one river as good as another? When God specifies his church, could one church be as good as another? Maybe Naaman reason why everybody knows water can't cure anybody. But whatever it is, it seems to have offended his popular prejudice. Notice Naaman's rage. That word means burning anger. He went away in a rage. He had an improper perspective of all of this. He saw himself as Naaman the captain. Elisha and God saw him as Naaman the leper. Makes a difference how you see yourself. Read James chapter 1, verse 1. He was upset because things did not go according to the conception, his conception of how they should go. God is bigger than our thoughts. And notice, being in this rage, he removed himself from the one who could help him. And while he's raging and while he's going away, he's remaining a leper. Have you ever noticed when people get, as we say it, mad with God, they don't hurt anybody but themselves? But notice in verse 13 the confrontation. The servants had Naaman's best interest at heart. Now here you see another emphasis on servants working in Naaman's behalf. Notice their approach. His servants came near. They didn't stand afar. They came near to him and spoke to him. Notice the admiration his servants had for him. They addressed him as my father. But then I especially want to zero in on the arguments of the servants. They made two. If the prophet, if the Nabi had told you to do something great, would you not have done it? One writer said it's a great mercy to have those about us that will be free with us and faithfully tell us of our faults and follies, though they be inferiors. So these fellows were really Naaman's friends. Second, they said, how much more then when he says to you, wash and be clean. Now, when we give counsel and reprove, we must make it appear that it comes from love and true honor, and that we intend not reproach, but reformation. When we have to point out someone's error, let it be because we're trying to restore them, not rejoice in their error. Notice the cure would work by simple means. And I mentioned last night, God uses the little things. But in verse 14, notice the compliance. Naaman has to change his mind. So he went down and dipped. Now, if you have washed in verse 10, underscore dipped in verse 14. He went down and mark the coordinating conjunction 7 times in the Jordan, according to the saying of the man of Elohim, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. He performed the proper actions. Now I want you to understand this. Baptism was essential for Naaman's salvation from leprosy. It was essential. Now reason with me. Go and wash, bathe yourself in the Jordan 7 times. Did he have to go and wash, or could he just go and be clean? He went down and dipped. Now, dipped in the Hebrew means to dip oneself. But when the Hebrew word was translated into Greek for the Septuagint translation, the Greek Old Testament, the word is baptisato, to cleanse by dipping or submerging. And it's a part of the root, it's a part of the family from which we get our word baptizo, baptize. He immersed himself in the Jordan River 7 times. And notice that the cure demanded individual effort. He perceived the proper authority. Everything was done according to the saying of the man of God. Now this ties the baptism to the authority of God. And it shows that God's instructions do not change based on my thinking. God didn't run after Naaman and say, oh, well, if you figured it out to be this way, then we'll just change everything and do it the way you want it done. He didn't do that. In Psalms 119, verse 89, the psalmist said, forever, O Jehovah, your word is settled, and that Hebrew word means fixed in place. in heaven. It doesn't change because of what I think. And he procured the proper attainment. Notice, the cure was complete after complete obedience. His flesh was restored and he was clean. Now look at it. Baptism was essential for Naaman's cleansing from leprosy. Go plus wash, and your flesh will be restored and clean. Verse 10. He went and dipped, and his flesh was restored and clean. Question: was the washing, the dipping, essential for Naaman's cleansing? It was just as essential as the going. He had to do both of them. Baptism is essential for our salvation from sin. In Mark 16:16, he who believes and is baptized shall be saved. In Acts 2:38, repent and be baptized for remission of sins, salvation. In Acts 8:37, he confessed and was baptized in order to be saved. In Acts 22:16, Saul was told to arise and be baptized to wash away his sins. All right, you put the two together and notice this. Naaman's restoration and cleansing was on the other side of baptism. Our salvation from sin is on the other side of baptism. Just as Naaman was not clean before he was baptized, we are not saved before we're baptized. And I believe Naaman can help us see that. But then our final consideration tonight, verses 15 to 19, is Naaman's conversion. Notice his confession, verse 15, he returned to Elisha. Now this means he went about 40 miles out of his way as he normally would have gone to go home. I believe it shows two things. I believe it shows, number one, his gratitude, and number two, his conversion. He is grateful. If you were a leper and you were cured, would you be grateful? And he goes to show that appreciation. Those of us who were sinners and we were saved, are we grateful? Are we showing that gratitude? Are we showing the fact we left sin and came into a saved state, so we converted? And you see Naaman doing this. It's interesting, in Luke 17, verse 15, tied in with Naaman, that both of the lepers who returned, the 10th of the 10, the one of the 10, and Naaman, the one of the 10, returned literally to Jesus. Naaman came figuratively to Jesus, a member of the Godhead at that time, Elohim. But not only did he do that, in verse 15, he renounced idolatry. And he returned to the man of God, and he and all his aides, and came and stood before him and said, "Indeed, now I know that there is no Elohim in all the earth except in Israel." You see, the word gods, little g, O-D-S, is also in Hebrew the word Elohim. But he says, I know now that my gods are not gods. And there's only one God. Notice in verses 8 and 10, his knowledge was based on revelation. And in verse 14, confirmation of the revelation. I know there's no God in all the earth except in Israel, all right? Go wash 7 times in the Jordan River and you will be restored. You will be clean. He went and dipped 7 times in the Jordan River and he was restored. He was clean. Whom did Elisha represent? He represented God. And Naaman said, I give the credit for my healing, not to Elisha, but to God. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. Matthew 5, verse 16. Now we see in this, I think, 3 things. Number 1, Israel was to be a witness to the Gentiles. Isaiah will make this more abundantly clear when he begins to write. Second, this shows that the young girl, verse 3, and Elisha tied the work of the true prophet to God, Elohim. Nowhere was Elisha saying, look how great I am. Look what I can do. Look how powerful I am. The message showed the power is in the message. Romans 1:16, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power, not the preacher, not the teacher. It is the power of God unto salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. And it shows, number 3, that Naaman did not attribute his cleansing to the water of Jordan. He knew the cleansing came from God. He also knew he had to contact the cleansing, and you could add agent, from God in the water of the Jordan. People say baptism saves no one. 1 Peter 3:21 says it does. Because in baptism, one contacts the cleansing agent, the blood of Jesus Christ. Nobody says we're saved by the water. We sing, don't we? What can wash away my sins? And we answer, nothing but the blood of Jesus. But the question is, where do I contact the blood? God said it's in baptism. Where did Naaman contact the cleansing agent to cure his leprosy? It was in the waters of the Jordan, when he baptized himself, dipped himself in the Jordan River. One writer said, it was a happy cure of his leprosy, which cured him of his idolatry, a more dangerous disease. Sometimes, I mentioned this last night, sometimes it takes a tragedy, it takes illness to bring somebody to the realization, I need God. It took a little girl whose name we do not know. I look forward to getting to heaven and metaphorically to walk down Faith's Hall of Fame and learn her name. Look at what an unnamed little girl accomplished for God in bad circumstances. As blessed as you and I are, what can we accomplish for God in our good circumstances? Our God is bigger than our thoughts.